All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Geneve Dupuy, and this afternoon I will be taking you through a quick presentation on the NJSLA and NJGPA math assessments to make sure we are ready for this spring. And at the end, we will certainly follow with a question and answer portion. So please jot down some notes, and if you have questions as we go through this, I will gladly answer them towards the end of our session. So let's get started. So our agenda for today, we are going to go over a quick timeline. We will discuss a bit about the construct of the assessments. We will go over the content briefly and show you where to get some resources, and then talk a little bit about the climate and setting the stage for your students. I'm going to share two resources at the end that we're providing. One of them is an error analysis activity that you can use with your students, and another is a calendar that you can edit to help you plan out your assessment prep as you go through the next few months. So for each of our sections here, I want to give you a little bit of information about where to go to find the details you'll need, as well as some key information to keep in mind. So in terms of timeline, the NJGPA assessment, which is for our 11th graders, is very quickly approaching. The administration dates are March 13th to March 17th. And the makeup session is the week following. For the NJSLA administration, so that's grades 3 through 9, that is May 1st to May 26th of this year. You can find the detailed test schedule on the state's website at nj.gov. You'll find the assessment schedule. And the administration window for the NJSLA is 4 weeks long, as you'll notice. So your district or school testing coordinator will have the information about when your school and students are specifically testing. So if you haven't had training on administration yet, that will probably be coming shortly. And that's when you will have that information and be able to more in detail outline your timeline for preparing your students. Okay, so when we talk about the construct of these exams, they are fairly similar from grade level to grade level, but there are some slight differences that you should definitely be aware of. So the first thing and the need to knows, I would say, are the unit lengths. For our elementary and middle school students, they will each test in 3 units that are 60 minutes each. And our high school students, meaning our 9th graders, whatever subject they are testing in, generally algebra, and our 11th graders who are taking NJGPA, they will do 2 units that are 90 minutes each. Calculators are not permitted for any parts of the 3rd to 5th grade assessments. They are permitted at higher grades for some tasks. However, it is important to know that every single assessment does have non-calculator sections that are at the beginning of the first unit, and students will have to do some mathematical calculations by hand. The tech tools that are available to students at the different grade levels do vary a lot, and the resources here can really give you some details about how to interact with them. So I just want to go to the Pearson Assessment Center resource quickly, just to give you a quick tour of what is key information for students here. So at the top, you will see the menu that says Educator Resources, and there are both tutorials and practice tests here. The difference is that the tutorial is a little bit more general overview of how to use the software, whereas the practice test is a full content-based practice test for each grade level or subject. These are definitely something you're going to want to expose your students to if you have not yet, so that they're not feeling super pressured by the technology requirements of the assessment when the time comes. So what's really great about the tutorials is that they are broken down by grade level to show the different tools that students will have access to. So I'm going to give you a quick sample of those on the next slide, but so you know, 3rd to 5th grade, 6th and 7th grade, 8th grade, and then high school have access to slightly different tools and equation editors. So depending on what grade levels you teach or support, you may want to look at multiple tutorials and decide what to highlight for your students and what they'll have to manipulate that is a little bit different than the things they're used to. What is also great is that there are standalone guides and tutorials for the equation editors themselves. And just to give you a quick look at the equation editor for anyone who is unfamiliar, this is an example of the 6th to 8th grade equation editor. So students will have to be comfortable inputting their answers, utilizing a number of symbols and putting them in the correct sequence. For example, if a student is putting in a mixed number for their response, they'll have to be comfortable selecting that button and then filling in the different pieces of the mixed number. And this in itself can be a challenge for students, especially when you see how many functions there are. And again, this is just the 6th through 8th grade equation editor. The 3rd to 5th grade one is a little bit more basic, and the high school one has a lot more functions. So it's definitely a tool that you will want to explore and also introduce your students to. Going a little bit deeper into the tech tools that you're going to find on the tutorials and practice tests, there are different things, again, available at different grade bands. So your 3rd to 5th grade students will have to be comfortable manipulating an inch ruler, the equation editor that I mentioned, and number line plots. And for your 5th graders, they'll have to be comfortable with also coordinate grid plots. At the middle school level, they add in the protractor, as you'll see on the screen, and they also switch out the inch ruler for a centimeter ruler. And for 8th graders, there will be line graphing as well as system of equation graphing. So the graphing style on these questions involves students plotting 2 points on the line, and then the program will connect them. Some of our online tools that we use throughout our curriculum are just like that, and some are very different. So it would be very useful for students to get a little bit of practice with that. And then lastly, at the high school level, the graphing functions get even more complex. As you'll see on the screen, students have a function graph where they will have to determine what type of function it is they're graphing before they are able to put the key points on and manipulate them. So it'll be important for students to understand how to manipulate these, and if they are graphing higher level functions, what are the key points that they will have to manipulate. So all of this can be explored at the My Person support site and is definitely a great place to start or to revisit with your students if you are getting ready to plan your prep. Okay, so when we speak about the content of the assessments, the key takeaways are the content that is covered is really aligned to the major content of the grade level as identified in our state standards. So 70% of these assessments cover major content of the grade level, while the remaining 30% cover additional and supporting content. So assuming you are following your curriculum, you are likely following these standards, but you might decide to take a look at what is outlined as the major content so that you are certain you are addressing the things that are going to be assessed most. So if you go to the New Jersey State Learning Standards for Math webpage, There are a number of supporting resources that can help you identify which are those major content standards for your grade level. The easiest one I think to look at is the curricular framework that the state provides. So under supporting resources at the very bottom of the page, if you select one of the curricular frameworks, it will download a document for you. And that document outlines all of the major supporting and additional content standards. So you will follow the key that they give you at the bottom of the page. And those major content standards are these green squares. So these are the things that are going to be covered the most at each grade level. The additional and supporting content are represented by the open blue squares and the open yellow circles. So those are the more supplementary information that is covered on 30% of the assessment. So that is a great resource for being able to identify if your curriculum that you are teaching is right online. The other thing that you want to be aware of is just the type of skill required to answer each question type. So all of the tests have 3 types of tasks: type 1, type 2, and type 3. Type 1 tasks are really assessing students' conceptual understanding and their fluency of procedures for grade level skills. Type 2 tasks are assessing their ability to write out reasoning and justification for the math that they do, and also to critique the reasoning of others. And type 3 tasks are assessing their modeling ability. And we're going to look at some quick examples of each of those momentarily. All of these released items can be found in either the New Meridian Resource Center database or the New Jersey Digital Item Library database. And I will share these links at the end for you if you do not have them. But those are 2 great resources to find released items so that you can see each type of question. And for each grade level, between the tutorials on the Pearson website and the released items, there are over 100 questions for students to practice at each grade level. The last thing that can really help your decisions about content to address to prepare students are previous years' data. So individual and district student reports can provide some guidance on what standards and question types to target, and we will look at some samples of those shortly. So the type 1 questions that address procedural fluency, they can come in a variety of ways. Students aren't just doing your standard multiple choice. They will be doing category sort problems. They will be doing selected response problems where there are multiple correct answers, and they have to choose all of the correct ones and none of the incorrect ones to get the credit. And they'll also be doing those constructed response problems with the equation editors that I showed you. So a really good way to prepare students for this kind of variety is just very frequent and intentional exposure to released items. There are a few ways you can do this. One way is to just provide students with released items in a mixed up variety, like print out a test from 2019 and let the students see the questions as they were presented. One thing we know is that very often students can get a skill and perform proficiently with it at the end of unit exam, but then when it comes time for a cumulative assessment, they might struggle to switch from topic to topic. Teaching them how to prepare their scrap paper, how to identify questions they know how to answer first, and then go back to other questions can be a really good strategy for overcoming some of that anxiety that comes from having multiple types of tasks to answer. Another good way to introduce type 1 tasks are side by side when you're introducing new topics. So as you are going through the remainder of your lessons between now and the assessment time, you can pull released items and show students how they look compared to how the questions in your curriculum or in your homework looks. Another great way is to introduce items that you've already taught the standards to through cumulative review. You can add an additional question here or there to do nows, exit tickets, or homework assignments, just to see what skills students have retained. And if the format is a little bit different for the NJSLA, to give them an opportunity to experience that. And then lastly, one of the best ways to get students prepared for the variety of response types is to let them interact with the items in their tech enhanced formats. So the New Jersey Digital Item Library is a great way to do that because all of the items there are presented in the same way they were on the virtual assessment. So students can interact with the equation editor, they can graph lines and other functions, and they can really get a feel for how they would have to respond exactly on the test. When we are talking about our type 2 and type 3 tasks, these are the multi-part questions that contain constructed responses, and they're broken down into two types again. The type 2 are assessing their ability to construct arguments and distinguish correct reasoning from flawed reasoning. And the type 2 are assessing their ability to apply math techniques, construct real-world models, and use those to solve multi-step contextual problems. The most common thing I hear from students when I am coaching or from their teachers is that a lot of students just fill in, "I don't know" for these problems. And that is definitely a habit we need to break them out of, because when we look at the score breakdown, it is going to be impossible to pass without getting some of those constructed response points. You don't need to get them all, but you definitely need to get some. So we need to get students in the habit of actually tearing apart those questions and looking for the parts that they can answer. And a great way to do this is to have to provide them frequent and intentional exposure to the scoring criteria. So the rubrics and sample student responses that are available through the New Meridian Resource Library are a great way to start this process if you haven't already. Some students might be a little bit shy about sharing their own responses in class, but you might find that when you give them the rubrics and let them see how other students have responded, they will recognize that there are things that they have to contribute, and that can be a great way to start driving the discussion. In addition, part of the part 2 task is to identify flawed logic. So if you give them sample student responses without the scores and have them do some error analysis on those problems, that can be a really great way for them to develop that skill as well. And another strategy is to provide frequent opportunities to receive feedback on the justifications they come up with and the models that they create. One thing that was really eye-opening to me with reviewing the rubrics that are provided is that very often it will say in the rubric, any viable mathematical solution or justifiable mathematical solution. So they'll give you an example of what they think is a great response. And let's say that great response involves students multiplying. But then they'll also say any justifiable mathematical solution will also earn credit. So in a situation where the question is about multiplication, if a student used a strategy like repeated addition, they would still be able to gain credit. But a student might not recognize that if they don't have frequent opportunities to get feedback and to understand the scoring criteria of some of these problems. So it can be very encouraging to them to give them that feedback prior to testing. So one of the biggest tips overall about preparing for the content is to use your data. So we talked about introducing some cumulative review questions, and you can really use that as data tracking in itself. So if you include a question on your do now. Keep track of what standards you've already assessed and what percentage of your class did well with that standard. Set a goal for yourself, and when that goal is met, you're ready to move on to a different standard. Start strong data can also be something worth revisiting if you haven't looked at it in a while. There may be some topics that students typically do well with from year to year that you were surprised by, and that can be a great place to dive in and do some quick fixes. For example, I was working with a school who was shocked that their students didn't do well with Pythagorean theorem as they thought they would. And it turns out it really had to do with the timing of school closures last year, like when classes had to go out, because they were like, kids always do great with that. So they retaught it and they're feeling much better going into the testing session. And then another thing that you can use are previous year's data, which I will show you some examples of now. So as we know, each individual student gets a score report. And the details in the score report break down how well students did by major content, additional and supporting content, math reasoning, and modeling and application. So you'll see that these align with the types of problems that are assessed. The major content and additional and supporting content are primarily assessed through those type 1 problems and can be identified, that can be distinguished based on the state standards. So if you have students that are, like in this example, struggling to meet expectations with major content, but doing well with additional and supporting content, you might need to throw more of your focus to those standards that have the filled in green squares and not address so much those standards that are additional and supporting. Then the expressing math reasoning is associated with those type 2 justification problems. So if you have data that says that your students are struggling there, you can make an effort to do more of those problems or have more discourse in your class so that students have to explain their reasoning more. Lastly, the modeling and application score aligns with those type 3 problems. So if that's where the struggle is, you can definitely make an effort to include more of those problems in your instruction. If you are a district or school leader and you've got access to your district data, this can be a great time, if you haven't already, to identify some of those trend areas where grade levels struggled in the past. So the district data is going to show you how well your students performed against the state. So any of those dots that are below the line are opportunities to improve. Excuse me. And most importantly, any of those dots that are below the line towards the higher end of the graph are your quicker opportunities to improve, because these questions are ordered from most to least difficult. So if students are scoring below average on those less difficult problems, those can be really great places to tell your teachers, hey, we should really throw some extra emphasis into these standards so that our students have a better chance with some of those easier problems. And the last thing that I want to address is setting the climate. So we know that test anxiety is very real, and throw on top of that, math anxiety is very real. So we want to make sure that we are being very conscious of not increasing those things as we get closer and closer to the assessment. And one way to do that is to really start now by building your students' mindset around the reason for testing and their goal outcome. I know a lot of people, students in particular, don't feel like these tests are relevant to their lives, but they are still going to be facing a lot of the same challenges that they will in other situations in their lives. So they need to develop their stamina, self-regulation, and perseverance. And so any ways that you have been establishing classroom and school culture around these things can be amped up around testing time. And you really want to communicate to students that it's important for them to do their best so that the results can be looked at as data to use to grow. They're not going to be looked at as a value judgment, but as somewhere to grow from. People have a lot of ways of addressing their climate in preparation for testing. I'm going to share just a couple of suggestions. One favorite quote that I always used in my classroom when we would start test prep, this is know thyself, know thy enemy, 1,000 battles, 1,000 victories, by Sun Tzu, the Art of War author. So you might not need to get militaristic like I did, but I think my students really resonated with this quote because I often had students that were taking their algebra assessment for the second or third time. And, they were a little bit beaten down by that. So to really get them to think about like, what are they learning about themselves through this experience was useful. For sports people, Kobe's got a lot of great gems, or whoever students are fond of, you can generally find a great sports quote for them. So that might be something that you want to ask students, like, which of these points really resonates with you and why, and how can we apply it to your educational goals and your testing goals in particular. And then lastly, like, let's not forget, we can always go the route of education and think about our growth mindset. I know this is something that is commonly talked about. So students might have some knowledge of this already. So it can be a great stepping stone to have them think about what difficulty and what the feedback they're getting is really doing for them. So these are just a couple of suggestions for ways to center climate conversations in your classroom. And with that, I would love to hear your questions. So if anybody would like to share in the chat or come off mute. Was I that thorough?
Hi, this is hi, I'm Hillary Kaiser. I'm a Phillipsburg teacher. I teach 8th grade math. Could you just review? I know you said you would share those links again, but can you back through, because I have them saved from years prior, but could you just go back to the New Jersey standards, the new meridian, just so I can refresh where I can find some of the most updated items?
Absolutely. I will switch over to sharing those tabs and kind of walk you through each of them right now. Okay, so I'm going to start with the digital item library. Or at least I think I am. Okay, so nj.digitalitemlibrary.com. Let me just make sure I'm sharing the right thing. Yep. So on this page is the way that you will find the questions that you can interact with in their tech enhanced format. So if you search for math, search for your grade level, it'll sort by standards, and you can select a standard and see the item types there. And so this would be a constructed response item where students just type in the answer. This is an example of a type 2 item where students have to use the equation editor. So if you copy the link from here, it's nice because you'll see that the URL has the item number at the end. So if you save that URL, it'll take you right to the question you are looking at. So let's say you identify an item you want to use with your students, like something like this would be great for them to experience how to do the multiple select by category and row. Copying that will take you right there. And then at the bottom, you can see correct responses, or if you make your own selections, you can score responses and reset until you get the correct response. So that is the digital item library. So next up is New Meridian Resource Port. So that is where you will find the full sets of released items and sample student responses. So for example, if I click on the 6th grade sample student responses, I will get the prompt that they received, the rubric, so students can do their self-evaluation, or you can use it to score students, and then a set of sample student responses with annotations, meaning they include the score and the reason for the score. So these can be the great ones to use for error analysis. And then lastly, I was just referencing the state website as a resource for the general information regarding the test content and makeup. So nj.gov/education, go to assessment, and this site contains links to the unit times, testing schedules, sample forms for mailing out score reports and like sharing scores, as well as the information about each assessment and the blueprints that contain the number of questions for each. All right, does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, a couple other questions in the chat. Somebody asked about ideas for incorporating these strategies into centers. One idea that I've seen work very well recently is a jigsaw strategy. So essentially having students complete all of the questions either on their own, like prior for homework, or with the class, and then reviewing the questions and making each group responsible for the solution to one question in particular. And then you can mix up the groups and have them work independently and in small groups and do like a peer taught model. That's more like a small group model. For active centers, I would think a really good way would be to use your type 3 modeling questions and to incorporate some manipulatives and help students build that bridge from the concrete modeling to the type of modeling that they'll do to answer a question. So I think that can be a really good way to utilize some of these questions for centers as well.
Just to answer that question too, something that you mentioned the jigsaw method.
Mhm.
I've used kind of like the tic-tac-toe method for homework and like spiral review of like type of standards, like because I teach 8th grade, so some things I picked from 7th grade content where they should have that foundational skill. So I'll intermix them with like content we're doing already in class, and the kids have to do like 3 in a row to make tic-tac-toe. So at least in each row, they would have a couple choices of some of these questions that were like self-selected, like type ones, because that gets me knowing like if they understand my type 1 questions. So I don't really have to spend a lot of time on them. That's helpful. I don't know if that gives an idea, but.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. I like that idea a lot. I've definitely shared that in workshops before, so definitely a good option. And what's great about that is it gives the option for student choice, right? But like you still get to be very directed in what you're putting on that board. So that's a great choice as well. And then I think I saw another question from someone. Number of questions with additional supporting as in the past. Do they provide the exact number of questions? So the blueprints show a breakdown of the number of questions. I didn't go deeply into that because we have all grade levels here, but I can show you where to get them. So 1 second. Okay, so back to our NJSLA.gov assessment page, if we click on the blueprints, NJSLA/M blueprints, you'll get a breakdown of each grade level, question type, number of items, and point value. And this is essentially the high level overview, but it gives you a nice summary of how many questions and then the points assigned to each type of question. And then for details about past assessments, so this is just like the outline, but for details about past assessments, that information would come from the New Meridian website from their alignment documents. So they tell you specifically for each question, what was the item type, what was the standard assessed. Let me switch over to that real quick, just so you can get an idea. So back to the New Meridian for that more detailed view. The alignment document will give you that information. So for each question, they specifically tell you what's the standard, what's the subclaim. So A is major, B is minor, additional or supporting. And I didn't mention this before, but C is the reasoning. Those are assessing major content as well. And then the task type, the number of points, they tell you specifically if it was a calculator or non-calculator section, and then they tell you what the response type was. So that's where you could get that real nitty-gritty detailed information, whereas the blueprint kind of gives you just the overview of point values. You're very welcome. Any other questions? All right, well, I'm gonna hang out for a little bit. I'm gonna drop those links in the chat right now. If anybody has questions as they review them, like feel free to hang out for a few and ask me those questions. You are all welcome and good luck getting ready. And then the giveaways that we have for you are going to be emailed out to anyone who was registered. But for those of you who are still here, I'm dropping those in the chat right now. This first one is an error analysis activity. And I will just show you, when you click on it, it will prompt you to make a copy for yourself. And then you can use it with your students. Let me just show you a quick example. So you can have them work out the solution, identify and explain an error, show out the correct solution, and then share the strategy. So depending on how you choose to use this, you can provide them a solution with an error, or you can have them work out solutions and then basically trade and grade sort of thing, where they do some analysis of each other's work. And then the other link I'm sharing, it will also prompt you to make a copy. And this is a calendar that you can edit. It has a countdown to the start of testing. So if you find out that your NJSLA testing is a little bit later, you can update the number of weeks. And then at the bottom of each month, it has a couple of questions that you can consider. So like for February, have your students explored the testing environment? And have I explicitly explained each type of task and shown them samples of each? So you can also edit those things if your priorities are different, but they're just some suggestions to get you planning. So that is the second link that I'm about to drop right now. All right, I think that's all. So yeah, for the error analysis activity, you can provide the problem and the sample solution. So if you wanted to use an example from like a released item, you could do that and give them like the information, the response that the student generated, and then have them identify the error. And then if depending on what level of comfort they have with this already, you can give them the rubric and say like grade this student's work, or you can just see like, are you ready to identify the error on your own? Another option is that you can give them a problem and have them all work out their problem in the student work area. And then after you've had an option to pick some out, you can have them identify the errors in the student work and then correct it on their own. So there's a couple of different ways that you could use it.
I just wanted to say thank you.
Oh, you are very welcome.
Said I saved the links I'm on my iPad and my computer, but you said you're gonna send the email out to.
Yeah, we'll follow up with the links as well.
Well, thank you so much for the information. It was a helpful reminder on this stuff.
Awesome.
Yeah.